Welcome to Module 4 of Painting Fundamentals. For this module, we'll be tackling texture, light, and how to use them to your advantage in a painting. We will also focus on the use of underpaintings to establish value scales and create a more vibrant painting. Texture, along with line, color, value, shape, form, and space, are the 7 elements of art. We've covered the others in some respects so far, and in this module we'll explore texture and how light can help it convey it realistically. Texture refers to the way an object feels to the touch or looks as it may feel if it were touched. In this painting, the texture on these forms creates the illusion of dimensionality. The way the artist has suggested how light may interact with these objects, as well as using the lines decorating these objects to infer that they are most likely stones. Without the textural marks, these may just seem like odd organic forms. Texture gives us the extra visual cues needed to determine that they are stones. In this still life, texture is conveyed through various elements and treatments of the objects. The way the light hits the more reflective surfaces gives us the impression of smooth objects, while the light on some of the bread and other food items gives us a soft feeling in our mind's eye. Even the sharp folds in the tablecloth give us an idea of how it would feel if we were to touch it. These are forms of visual texture. Visual texture is otherwise referred to as implied or giving the illusion of texture on a two-dimensional surface. An example of this is if the paint is applied smoothly but gives the impression of a textured subject matter. While looking at and rendering objects, it's important to understand how many different textures may appear. With rough textures, light is usually reflected unevenly. Smoother textures reflect light more evenly. Matte surfaces reflect soft, dull light, and shiny surfaces are the opposite of matte. Chrome or shiny surfaces reflect most of the light back at the viewer. They may also act as a mirror of sorts. Here we have 3 spheres, each with a different surface quality. The one on the left is matte. This means it reflects a little of the direct light and its value structure acts as a typical spheres would. Note how the highlight is more diffuse than the others. The more matte the surface, the more diffuse the highlight is because the light scatters across the surface. In the center is a glossier sphere. It reflects much more of the light source. It still has its halftones, highlights, core shadows, and the like, but it has more defined highlights and a sharper reflected light from the other red sphere. Finally, the chrome, or completely reflective surface, mirrors its surroundings. The cast shadow is reflected into the sphere, and the reflected light on the left shows the shape of the orb beside it. Its highlight is very sharp and reflects all the objects on its surface, albeit warped depending on the surface curvature. We can explore this phenomenon further by looking at ordinary objects. The egg has a fairly matte surface. The bumps on its shell help diffuse the light hitting it. To render this, we would need to understand that the highlight is less distinct and bleeds into the halftone. There's more of a hint of a highlight than a strongly defined one. The cue ball next to the egg is far glossier. It has a much smoother surface, therefore it reflects light more efficiently. Notice how the highlight is a sharp circle in the middle of the halftone and well defined. Finally, the orange is somewhat glossy, but its surface is marked by multiple dimples. These dimples diffuse the light, but unlike the egg, the waxy surface of the orange is more reflective. This causes several scattered highlights within the halftone. There's something wrong with these croquet balls. They're set up indoors in a shaft of sunlight and they're resting on black velvet. Maybe you guessed that the images have been doctored in Photoshop. What's wrong with them is the color of the reflected light. The green ball should shift the shadow towards a greenish yellow. However, it looks wrong because it's reflecting red. Remember from Module 2 that all objects are reflective. Color works by reflecting any colored light not absorbed by an object. In this case, the green ball should be reflecting green light into the yellow ball. We can see the phenomenon of reflected light in this image. The proximity of the croquet balls to each other and the white board behind them show how the strong directional light reflects the color of the balls. The reflected light spills over onto the adjacent piece of whiteboard. The colored light then bounces up and to the right. Think of it as literally bouncing off the surface it hits. However, the reflected light dissolves rapidly as the distance increases from the balls and the reflected colors mix into the intermediate areas. Furthermore, the color in the reflected light in the shadow is a combination of the reflected light combined with the local color of the object itself. You can see this in the reflected light in the shadow of the yellow ball. The colors within the shadow are the red reflected and the yellow base. This effect is usually clearest if you remove other sources of reflective and fill light. In this project, we'll use one primary light source. When looking at objects with a less reflective surface, such as this highly textured orange and egg, the highlight will be more diffuse. However, the core shadow and the highlight will still show where the light source is coming from. Here too, we can see the reflected light from the highly saturated orange reflected on the egg in one of the reflected light areas. Due to the proximity of the shapes, the orange cast a reflected light onto the egg and the white cast a shadow on the orange. This happens because the light bouncing off the orange. There's no reflected light from the egg because the egg isn't reflecting onto the orange. It blocks the light source. Take time setting up your still life. Remember Module 3, your composition is just as important as your finished painting. It took me several angles and orientations to produce a satisfying composition. Make at least 3 thumbnails composing your still life. Make sure to note at least 3 values while studying your setup. You will need to include 5 in your finished painting. I settled on this arrangement. I was looking for something complex enough to engage me, yet simple enough that I could execute it quickly. I started with a simple triangular composition and started arranging things to end up with this X-shaped layout. Using 2 of the darkest objects as tent poles for the composition, I created 2 semi-vertical elements in the work. Several triangular compositional elements are used to push the viewer's eye through the composition. You could even extend some of the lines through the cast shadows as a way of inviting the viewer into the composition. This assignment will teach you how to accurately render complicated reflections and textures by breaking them down into individual stages that are easier to focus on. I begin by drawing my composition on a painting surface. I'm carefully observing the forms to replicate them as accurately as possible. By looking at what shapes are created by shadows and highlights allows me to puzzle piece the forms together. When working, I like to think of going from general to specific. First, I draw the general forms, and then I go into the specific areas that the shadows and highlights are creating. I'm now focusing on adding a quick value sketch over my line drawing. Think of this as a version of our monochromatic still life. I'd like to use a darker pencil such as a 6B or an 8B to get my values down, but you can use charcoal, pencil, or a light wash in black and white before you're underpainting. This will allow me to establish what areas I will work first. Once I finish, I will paint over the drawing with my matte medium to isolate the graphite from the paint. This will keep it from bleeding into the painting. There are other ways of getting your drawing on the paper. I freehanded mine, but you could also trace and transfer a photograph. You could also use the grid transfer method. Basically, the grid method involves drawing a grid over a reference photo, then drawing a grid of equal ratio on your work surface. This allows you to draw the image on your paper by focusing on one square at a time until the entire image has been transferred. This method is far more accurate than freehanding, and many beginners find that it saves them a lot of time. I've uploaded a PDF of a step-by-step how-to guide in the module folder. This method will save you a ton of time. I'm now applying my underpainting. Underpaintings are an important part of your value scale. In Module 3, we explore value structures, and underpaintings push these further. To apply an underpainting, think about what your main subject's color scheme is, then find its complement. Since this project is focusing on oranges and my composition has a warm color scheme, most of the undertones are warmer hues. So I'll use blue as an underpainting, specifically manganese blue hue. If I were painting something, say, yellow, I might use magenta or violet. If I was painting red, then I'd select green, or if green, perhaps use red, and so on and so forth. This causes the colors that we apply to fight against the complementary base. This is opposition theory in play and tricks our eyes into seeing the colors as more vibrant in the painting. I'll apply a quick wash over the entire painting surface, then apply more glazes over the areas of darker value. I'm essentially painting a value scale over my drawn value scale. This will become important later. Once the value scale and underpainting are finished, begin painting your background. You should always paint your background prior to painting your subjects, as it keeps you from leaving it for the last minute or accidentally painting over your subject. For this project, we'll be covering the entire page with your underpainting and colors for the background. Don't leave any of the white of the page showing for this project. As far as how to pull a straight line, focus on where the edge of the brush pulls the paint. Brushes are a little tricky as they do kind of conceal where the bead of paint is. A brush with more paint and medium, or as we'll call it a wet brush, will pull easier than a drier one. It's also easier to pull a line than push one. It does take some time and confidence to get this level of hand-eye coordination, but with enough practice and a keen eye, you can gain muscle memory for this in no time. Before we start painting our hues, we need to look at what colors we'll need. It's important to understand that what we perceive as local color is not the hue that we will be using. Notice how the so-called black on A is slightly a darker gray than it is black. B is much darker red-orange than it is orange. C is like B in the fact that they're both closer to a red-violet than an orange. The egg is not going to be just a grayscale, it will be reflecting the other colors around it, so the darkness is a little more of a very dark brown. The same thing with E, it's a bit of a dark brown, it's closer to a tint of burnt sienna. This is why it's important to not just assume the local color is the color you'll be using. Close observation of your subject matter is always important when painting, especially when color matching. Knowing these pitfalls, we can go ahead with our color mixing. I don't like to use straight black from the tube. It tends to flatten a painting out, and even the best applications look bad. Tube black is a mixer. I prefer to mix my own blacks as it gives me more control over the undertones of my darkest hues. Since this is a warmer painting, I'm going to use some orange and some burnt umber. Then I'll mix them together into a much richer black. If you feel you need to get your hue a little darker, feel free to add just a little bit of black. However, don't let it overwhelm your colors. Here you can see my mixed black has a lot of the same properties as the tube black. However, one of the main differences is the tube black won't be as rich on your painting. They have the same opacity and the same consistency, but when added with a little bit of fluid, you can see how there's a warmer shade versus this cool bluish black shade. Your own mixed blacks will also feel more opaque and will allow for easier glazing for covering your surface. Faced with something that's heavily textured, many beginners may ignore value and form in pursuit of rendering texture. Some may focus too much on the minuteness of texture, say such as painting every brick in a building or rendering every blade of grass in a field. To avoid these pitfalls, we will establish our value scale first. By painting light to dark, we can better render our forms first, paying special attention to the shape and value of our compositions. Texture can bring a painting to life, but it's only icing on the cake. The painting will feel more unified if the objects are fully rendered before focusing on textures. Ultimately, painting naturalistically requires patience, time, and a keen eye. I'm trying to make sure that I have a good even coverage while maintaining the shapes of my midtone, or rather the darkest shadow on these objects. Once they dry, I'll add a few more layers just to establish the darker areas. Over time, more layers of a dark hue, such as a mixed black, will create a very rich black. I'm continuing with my darker shades, moving around the painting, not focusing on one place at any one time. It's a process. Once I've gotten my darks down, then I'll have to move on to the second darkest colors, and then so forth and so on. So after I've covered my darker shades, I'm focusing on some of the darker hues, such as the zest on this slice of orange. Once I have my darks laid out, I then move to the halftones and the saturated hues. This is where the color mixing and matching is the most important. This is also the stage where you should focus on looking for reflected light in other areas. Notice how I'm not applying texture just yet. This is the focal object, and it will need a lot more time and attention, but that comes later. I'm applying my brushstrokes generally. This will give the orange a hint of rough texture without overworking it. And only towards the end do I think about adding my highlights, which in this case are just a few quickly applied strokes. Moving on to the cup, I've already applied my darker values, so now I'm using some hues to accentuate the reflections and reflected light of the orange. Notice how I've used an orange stripe mixed with my orange black for the reflected light. Remember how reflected light will be a mix of the two objects' colors. Moving back to the orange slice, I'm establishing the middle tones and avoiding the rind. I want to establish the darker hues before I move into the rind. So I'm mixing just a little bit of my orange with a little bit of green and yellow to desaturate the colors just a little. Doing so will create a solid base and allow me to revisit and add more layers later. Moving to the kettle, I want to start establishing some of the texture to emulate the brushed stainless steel. I will be doing so by painting the reflections to mimic its reflective surface. Using sharp strokes with a dry brush technique and flicking it upward from the base of the shadows, I can imitate the reflection. I'm also being careful not to overwork this. Once the kettle is in a good place, I move to work on some of my cast shadows, just to kind of reinstill the shapes of some of the forms. This is more color correction than anything else. I had my occlusion shadow just a little too dark and wanted to make sure it was right. At this point in the painting, I'm about 75% done. I can now begin working on cleaning up and adding texture. I'm going to focus a little more on some of the highlights in the cup. By using a little bit of my orange black and working wet into wet, I can create a bit of a gradient. While building up the highlight on the lip of the cup, I'm using a bit of gray shade and orange black, then mixing wet into wet with a little bit of white. I'll finish the cup by painting a little bit of the highlights within the rim, as well as punch up the orange in the reflection. Now that I'm at the stage where I can focus on texture, I'll move into the highlights on the decanter. I noticed that the orange slice is reflected in the kettle. Since it's not a pure mirror, it will not appear as a direct orange slice. So just a hint of the orange's color can be used to suggest form reflected in the brushed metal. By taking a little bit of off-white and mixing it into one of the midtones of the chrome, I can depict the highlight of the kettle. This is how the light source is reflected into the form. A round spotlight will stretch along a cylinder to create an elongated highlight. I've used a dry brush technique the entire time on this kettle. However, it is fine to go back over with a little bit of matte medium or airbrush fluid to smooth out some of the marks you make. There are a variety of ways to figure out how to solve the problem of texture. Try out a variety of mark making with your brushes. You can even try using different tools such as sponges, sticks, sgraffito, and some of the other things we explored in Module 1. Now that most of the painting has been resolved, it's time to focus on the orange slice. It's the most complex part of the painting, so I'll spend extra time and care trying to express the texture. While the texture of the orange is incredibly complex, if we render texture sparingly, we will be able to communicate the form of the orange to the viewer without ever overworking it. I'm adding just a little bit of yellow-white for some of the membrane in the orange. I'm following the shape and blending out just a little bit to soften the colors. You can use anything such as a brush or your finger to blend out colors. I'm using some loose brushwork along with blending to capture some of the highlights within the membrane. Now I'm working on building up the hue of the orange. Remember how I started with a desaturated orange earlier. This will help express the form of the orange acting as an outline without me having to draw one in. It also helps push the more saturated hues forward. Now that I build up the form using hues, I can finally work on my highlights. Instead of being literal with the highlights, I'm giving more of an impression. Finally, I'll add a little bit of texture with a darker hue. I'm doing this to act as a shadow to the highlights. Once I'm satisfied with how the orange looks, I'm going to fix the rind. You may have to color correct as you go. To add a little bit of texture to the orange's skin, I'm going to use a bit of a pointillist technique. I've only half loaded my brush, and I'm going to finish it out and blend it with my finger. By using a tint or a shade of your color, you can trick the eye into thinking that you are seeing light and shadow. Using a mixed technique of stippling and dry brush, you can create the texture of the rind. Again, be careful not to overwork the surface. I'm simultaneously placing the marks and trying to blend them out. Remember, just a suggestion of texture is more than enough to convey to the audience. I'll finish the orange by adding a few sharp highlights. I'm using my white from the tube and being very sparing. At this point, I noticed my highlights were a little too severe, so I blend them out to make them less noticeable. This will help integrate them into the image. As a final touch, I'm adding just a little bit of reflected light from the oranges onto the tablecloth. I'm using wet on wet, using the color I had from the tablecloth and mixing a little bit of the orange into it. Be sure to fan it out just a little bit. Remember, reflected light diffuses over distance. It becomes less saturated and duller. And with this, my painting is finished. In all, from start to finish, this took me maybe 4.5 hours. You should spend more than that on this painting. I want you to really focus on the shapes the reflections make, and I really want you to focus on how texture exists on your objects. I want you to carefully convey to me how the objects feel. This concludes Module 4. This module has included both the lecture and demo for this section. Please refer to the PDF of this video if you find yourself lost. There are other resources in the module as well, such as instructions on how to do the gridded transfer method and how to paint an egg.